In the summer of 1808, the world was electrified by the news of a battle. But it wasn't the fact that the battle had took place or the combatants themselves that took people by surprise. Instead, it was the outcome. For at the Battle of Bailen, Spain achieved the seemingly impossible. 20,000 men, supposedly some of Napoleon's finest, were vanquished by 30,000 Spaniards under the command of a man who was virtually unknown, Castaños. But what actually happened at the Battle of Bailen? Should this battle have even happened at all? And what were its consequences? Tonight, the redoubtable Josh Provan returns as we revitalise our Peninsular War Saga series. We talk about whether Bailen was really just a pipe dream in the grand scheme of things, whether or not DuPont was an utter idiot, and why Napoleon was quite so nasty to him. This is the Battle of Bailen, the Spanish Dream, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are very excited to be revitalizing our Peninsular War Saga series. The first installment of these were recorded more than a year ago, and we've been so busy with content since that we just haven't had the chance to get back to it. But at the core of this was always an intent to make sure we did justice to the Spanish and Portuguese sides of the saga. And so today we are going to do an episode that doesn't feature the British for a single second, other than the fact that I've just mentioned the British, but we'll ignore that just happened. Joining me once again is Josh Provan, the master of the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel, author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira, and Every Hazard and Fatigue. And he is studiously at work on another title that I won't spoil the details of just yet, because that's not my news to break. That's his story to share when he feels ready. Josh, welcome back to the show, buddy. Merry Christmas, because this one, if I've got my relevant episodes listed correctly in my head, goes out on Christmas Day, no less. You are our Christmas broadcast. You are basically like the king. I'm
El Rey Navidad.
Muy bien, señor. Muy bien. Uh, yeah, I wasn't actually anticipating opening this episode by likening you to His Majesty Rey Carlos. Rey Carlos el Tres.
Uh,
I'm not sure.
it,
So the reason
no,
that I'm
no,
hesitant.
no. Carlos Terce es muy antes. uh, he's Charles the Second. Charles the Third is my guy from the American Revolution. He's one of the better Bourbon kings. I don't know I don't know who we have at the second. It could be Carlos the Fourth. Is his name Carlos?
Well, this is the thing. What we've done is that we've now conflated the American War of Independence, the Peninsular War, and
Yeah.
2024.
Oh wait, no,
Because
hang on. Carlos the Fourth
yeah,
is
it is
the
Carlos
Peninsular
IV
War
and
guy,
Ferdinand, the guy who will go on to become
right?
Ferdinand the
So
Seventh.
then it's
But at
uh
present, sitting on the British throne, we have King Charles
oh, okay,
III.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I'm sorry. My head's in Spain. Yes, of course. Yes, indeed, it is Carlos. I think it's Tierte. Um,
Oh, okay. Oh, of course, because it's
it
third, isn't it?
in
Rather
the
than
yeah, yeah.
three.
I
Yeah.
believe it is. I believe yes. If you're talking about El Rey Inglaterra, then yes, yes, you're completely correct. And I'm off in Castile somewhere.
Well, now that we've been characteristically cack-handed in how we've approached the intro to this, folks, if you missed the earlier installments of the series, they are available in the back catalogue. Um, we've covered the Dostojev's uprising. We've looked at Relisa and Vimiro, the Convention of Sintra, all of that fun stuff. And we've also looked at the the early emergence of the guerrilla war. We also have
Hmm.
episodes, I believe they'll be out already, or rather, an episode with Beatrice de Graaf and Alex Mika talking about the international reaction to news of the Peninsular War over the course of 1808, talking about that ripple effect that this has, not just within Europe, but around the world, in as much as this conflict does reverberate around the world. But as I've said, today we are talking about Bailen, an installment that we deliberately parked as we dealt with the British stuff. But this is really important in terms of understanding quite why this conflict electrifies people in part, um, but also the, the sort of the contextualization of look, it's not just about the British. Before we came on air, Josh was ranting about precisely this fact. Um, Josh, would you care to fill our listeners in on the nature of your rant?
I will. I will. Give me a moment there because I'm about to do something which I realized a second ago. And for this I need to adopt my I need to adopt my rather faulty Spanish. So hang on a second. Para primero, con permiso, excelencia. Feliz cumpleaños. 2 días antes ahora, a nuestra amiga Silvia Gregorio. Muchas felicidades, Silvia. Y esperamos que hayas tenido un buen día. Y lo siento por mi mal español. Which is to say that 2 days ago, our friend Silvia Gregorio had a birthday, and I thought, because I was listening to the Head podcast on Santander earlier, we should give her a shout out in the spirit of the season and all that. And I did that for all to hear and mock in my rather faulty Spanish. So, moving on from there. We and Actually, another one of the weird things, because this rant was all about how unbelievable it is that something happened. It's also kind of unbelievable I've never actually spoken to Sylvia before.
Have you not?
No,
This is the trouble with you being up in Newcastle. You're just too far away from everything.
seems
Everything is
that
like a
way, yeah.
4 hour train journey from everywhere.
But anyway, yeah. In addition to it being ridiculous that I have not spoken to Sylvia, um, it's ridiculous, I think, that you have this period between the tumult of Aranjuez and the final defeat of the Spanish field armies in 1809 that is just so difficult to access in English. There's no easy go-to on a shelf to find out what was happening in this period of time. And as we'll see over the next few episodes, although you can make the argument that, without Moore it couldn't have happened. If you don't have this, if you don't have the Spanish pulling off this themselves, you have no basis for doing anything in Spain.
I mean, here. This is literally the point of this sequence to examine precisely this problem. Let's talk about where we are at in the context of this story. So we, as we discussed before, have the Dos de Mayo uprising. That's, as the name suggests, the 2nd of May, 1808. Now, what will lead to Bailen is essentially that's the sort of the I don't want to call it the sequel. It's the next chapter fundamentally within the Spanish story. We moved ahead and we started to look at the British being sent out, but the British are landing in sort of August time. So this is kind of what's happening as the British are getting their act together and working out, what are we going to send out? Oh, I tell you what, why don't we send out that force that we were going to send and go and take some Spanish colonies? But let's not mention that to anyone because that's not very good politics right now. But this ends up being really important, and this is part of the reason why Wellesley's able to do a sort of Wellesley thing, and Juno sort of there, sort of scratching his head, going, this is all very sort of strategically difficult for me, isn't it? enough of the British. They are now to be excised from the remainder of this podcast. Um, and I'm going to talk about personalities at the heart of this. I dropped a hint in the inverted commas sexy intro that I did. We've got Castaños and Dupont. Um, Castaños is a difficult figure to get a huge amount of information on, I find, because this is probably his high point. He has a career in politics post this. Um, but one of the things that particularly strikes me, apart from the fact that he has a very, very impressive nose and chin, if you look at his portrait, is that this is his first battle. And in fact, he makes this point to Dupont in a lovely little quote that we'll get to later on in the episode. This is his first time. He's a lieutenant general, I believe, elevated, I want to say 1803. Um, but apart from that, he's a hard character to sort of nail down. What do we know about him? Who is he?
Castaños is a gentleman. He's Everybody likes him. Everybody who meets him likes him, especially later on. The Spanish generals and politicians quickly have very sort of violent turns of affection and hatred for various people during this period. So it's not fair to say that everybody likes him all the time, but he's very difficult to dislike. He has had a relatively long career up to this point. You don't get to this rank in the Spanish Bourbon army quickly unless you're extremely well connected. Um, Castaños might indeed have been young for a general of his rank in the Spanish army, actually, because the the average age of a colonel in 1806 or something like that was in their 60s. So you can see that he had something about him. He seems to have done his service in various garrison postings. I think he was deployed during certain wars, but I don't think he saw any great amount of service. He certainly never commanded in any meaningful capacity an army in the field. But during the arguments about reforming the army, he would have been amongst the reformer type, along with guys like Pedro de Giron and others who thought that the army desperately needed fixing. And he wrote about it in the arguments prior to the Peninsular War, um, in letters and things about what needed to be done and how it needed to be modernized and things. So, but nobody really listened to these people because the army was too central to the state as it stood. So yeah, he's very difficult to get to pin down. He's not as well known, weirdly, as some of the other Spanish generals because this the those people we're not mentioning preferred other guys. Um, and if you don't have a champion from those other guys in this war, you don't get remembered very well. I'm looking literally right now at what I was looking at, which is a page from the Real Academia de la Historia, which has a page on Castaños. And at that, uh, if people want to have a rundown of his service record, you can go and look at that and press translate on the page if you can't read Spanish. Um, Basically, he's good material for a supreme commander.
That ended emphatically. I like that. I think henceforth the British shall be referred to as they who must not be named. Um, Either that or we call them the Dark Army or something in sort of homage to Harry Potter and the whole he who must not be named Voldemort, the Dark Lord thing.
What would
Having
it
to exp-
be? What would it be in Spanish? El Ejército Obscurado or something like that.
Ooh, the Obscuras. I like that. That sounds like a good
I
name for a
don't think that's the
regiment.
right word. It's hovering around the right word, but the Dark Army would translate something to that, I think.
Okay, okay. So that's Castaños. As we say, this will be his first battle. Um, but he's done well. Now let's talk about Dupont. Now Dupont is a general at this point. He is not a marshal. Um, if we want to indulge in what ifs, I wonder if there hadn't been a Bailen, whether Dupont might have been a sort of Peninsular War elevation a la Suchet, in the sense that he's got a decent track record from memory. Um, his career gets completely derailed by Bailen, like one mistake and that's it. I can't say I'm hugely sympathetic considering what he did at Cordoba, but we'll get to Cordoba and discuss that in due course. Give us a bit of context on Dupont.
Well, you and I are exactly on the same page with Dupont. I was thinking literally today when I was looking into whether Suchet was doing anything in this campaign that at this point, if you ignore what is going to come, there is nothing on paper that says that Dupont is a bad choice or he's been put into a sideshow or anything like that. Spain in 1808 for the French for Napoleon, he doesn't rate it as something that requires his best guys, but he has a lot of good guys in his army. So what he does, I think, is basically he says, "All right, you guys go and win some fame in Spain. I'm going to let you off the leash. These people are terrible soldiers. They're all cowards. They're all bandits. You, Dupont, you go off into Spain with the rest of the army. There's a whole bunch of major generals sent into Spain who have done well in 1807 and done well in 1806, and they're given a bit. This is a place a playground where they can have a bit of freedom, show Napoleon what they've got. The promotions are on the table. The counts of Cordoba and Valencia and Girona are on the table for you. These new titles, I will ennoble you if you do well in Spain. I think that's what's going on here because he has a good record. He was at Austerlitz. He was in the Prussian campaign. Um, Performed well, exactly like Suchet. His career up to this point is very similar, really trajectory wise, to Suchet. And well, this is the anomaly with Dupont because up to this point he doesn't. I don't think he shows any kind of um, lack of nerve up to this point. But then again, he's never been in an independent command before, as far as I can see.
And our conversation from the Battle of the Marshals returns with a vengeance, right? Because the independent command is one of the key assessors, and it's the sort of one of the things that separates the wheat from the chaff. Um, okay, before we talk about why it all goes wrong, I want to talk about the state of the Spanish army and go quite kind of nuts on this. We're talking about how really Napoleon is sort of looking at the Spanish army and going, well, yeah, no, really, this is a cakewalk. Um, Having said that, I was like you doing some reading and was very struck by an argument that was being made that the problem that the Spanish army has isn't so much the state of it pre Dos de Mayo, which I think is a contentious statement and one that there's a need for reform there. I don't think either of us would argue about that, but that the real problem comes with the mass influx of troops post Bailen and post Dos de Mayo as these ranks swell with inverted commas patriots who flock to the colours to try and serve and push out the French. And because of the rawness, that's what then dilutes the quality of the Spanish army. And so you've got these guys who might be quite enthusiastic, but they're not very good. And that's what causes Spain to fundamentally be a house of cards that very quickly topples. So I'm curious on your assessment of that because you know far more about the state of the Spanish army than I could ever hope to.
Well, it's not an easy thing to get a full kind of grip on, to be honest. Charles Esdale is really the guy that we need to talk to about this. And Charles, if you're listening and you take objection to anything I say in this episode regarding the Spanish army, then let the audience may know I will completely defer to whatever he says because he is El Jefe here. The problem post Dos de Mayo and prior, they're connected to some extent. That problem with the influx of new troops, volunteers, patriots, bandits, whatever. Um, that is made possible because of the horrendous reputation that the army has in society prior to the revolution. Um, it is seen as a bloated um, private club for people who have too much time and just want to be seen. If you want an example of the type reason that people hated it, you just need to look at the life of Godoy, and we need to do an episode about him as well. But he is one of the reasons why people hate the army. They hate it as well because uh, that's the officers. They hate it as well because for the soldiers are not very well taken care of, are not properly funded. Discipline is patchy in places, relatively speaking, and the troops have a bad reputation as well because there's no reason for them to have a good one. And so there's a great sense of anti-militarism in Spain when the rising starts. And so when the juntas take over, you have a clash between army officers and civil administrators, and an argument, a very, very forceful argument put forward that it's not the regular army that's doing the fighting here anyway, it's our patriots and stuff like that. We'll get to it during this episode. The cheering that Castaños's army gets when they go into Madrid is not for the regular soldiers who bore the brunt of the fighting, it's for the people like the garrochistas, the cowboys, the militia people, the patriots, who are then taken by the press and exalted above and beyond what they have actually been able to achieve. And that is where you get this dependence on not the regular army, but this idea of the national effort. So that's the connection there. That's why that's sort of like the recruitment problem is an issue for the post Dos de Mayo resistance. The regular army itself is to be honest with you, in terms of its effectiveness, it's fine. Realistically, most Ancien regime armies are fine, but you need a good general. I cannot stress too highly that Ancien regime armies require a general who will come in, break it, make it again for his own purposes, make it run the way he wants it to run, and they can. That's the strength of Ancien regime armies. They're not sort of as tightly governed, um, and do what he needs to do with it. But there isn't one in Spain at this time. Uh, the 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 problems are there's an excellent book by Charles Esdale on the Spanish Army of the Peninsular War. It's practically the only one as well that deals with it in detail. Uh, do please look it out if you can find it. It's going to help you understand a lot about what goes wrong and what could have gone right. Um, in a nutshell, it's not prepared for an invasion. It's relatively well prepared for foreign service, but because of the Bourbon compacts in which France has essentially been protecting the Spanish northeastern frontier for the majority of the 18th century, you do not have an army that is designed in any way, shape, or form to defend Spain from inside its borders. It's crippled by the fact as well that you have multiple captains general commanding uh, or governing various portions of Spain, each commanding armed forces. And so, as soon as you get an enemy coming in, all these guys think they're in charge and don't want to work with each other. and that just goes on and on and on and on and on because they never get a supreme commander until the those people who shall not be named appear. Uh, whole episode on the problems of the Spanish army in the Peninsular War. But the thing to remember is, as well, though, don't believe the whole they're rubbish, they're cowards, they can't fight. They can. It just needs to be. It's such a mess. What with the pre-Bourbon army's reputation and abilities, and then the post Dostimaya army's problems. It just can't catch a break to to operate effectively as it can. And there are glimpses that it can, but as some historians have pointed out, those people who shall not be named never saw the Spanish regulars fight properly, and therefore it didn't matter to them, and that they only saw the end result of the defeats. This is the golden moment where you will see potentially what could have happened if they had a supreme commander and someone who could have very rapidly fixed the army. Whether they could have done that or not, that's for people like Charles Ousdale to sort of tell us.
It is worth just emphasizing the first time that the British end up in a pitched battle alongside the Spanish is Talavera in 1809. Like that's a long time. A lot has happened in the course of this war. We are more than a year and a bit into the war by that point. That is what then goes and flavors everything else. The idea of the Spanish running away because they're frightened by their own gunfire and all the rest of it. This is where it comes from, which is at a very different point in the war than, I mean, look at where the British need to go in terms of developing their capabilities over the course of this conflict. They don't arrive on. We've made this about the British again. What am I doing? But just to hammer the point home, the British aren't all that when they arrive for the first time. Think about the cavalry and the endless headaches with British cavalry. There's a lot of learning that all sides need to do, and the Spanish have these problems that we've just been talking about. So don't believe everything you read in Sharp is basically the, almost the tagline for this show by this point in time. With all of this in mind, how do we get to Bailen? We've got the flying columns concept that Napoleon is essentially using to pacify the local population. Dupont's got 20,000. That sounds like a sizable number of men, but he's basically told Andalusia, make it mine. Heads for Cordoba, manages to occupy Cordoba. Not a great achievement, but okay, he's been given a task and fine. Yeah, go do your thing. Then proceeds to sack Cordoba, which, ends up being part of his problem, actually. And then it all sort of goes horribly wrong. Am I right in thinking his intended target was Seville or Cadiz?
The objective was to free the trapped French ships in Cadiz Harbor.
Okay.
So he was right. He was gunning for Cadiz, and he only got as far as Cordoba.
So, folks, it would be useful if you had a map open
Mm.
to assist you with that. Increasingly, I've taken to having a map open when I record the battle podcast because it just helps in terms of seeing things. So, as he marches south to Cordoba, then the country sort of starts rising kind of around him. Talk us through the the situation he's in. I mean, his forces aren't the crack troops, and I suppose this is one of the myths that we need to bust on behalf of the French, right? There is this perception: oh, look, the troops who stormed the Pratzen Heights suddenly get humbled by the Spanish and this general that nobody's heard of and only fought one battle and all the rest of it. Nah, these are sort of second line battalions. These are not crack troops. There is a little guard contingent
Mm.
actually in there. We'll get to that in due course. Um, but that's that. This is not an elite fighting force, right? He has got
No.
20,000 men.
Yeah.
Um, talk us through the challenges that he faces, and at what point is the decision made that he does actually need to cut and run? Because if I recall, he's meant to get orders to pull back to Madrid, but those orders never arrive because the Spanish have risen and they just kill all the messengers.
Well, it's the timeline is fascinating actually, and it just goes to show how little we really know about this period in Spanish history. Like all the people who listen to this show, the majority of them are interested in military history. With the timeline, they'll know some of the big points. I know some of the big points, but you don't actually understand how they fit in until you actually, find a moment to look into it. Dos de Mayo doesn't even have the effect people think it does. It's used by Napoleon as a lever to invade the place. He says, "Oh, they're rioting. I need to save it. This is my political cover. I can send the troop. I can send more troops in now. Yay!" Um, and he's encouraged. He's not even on the Spanish frontier anymore. He's not even at Bayonne. He's off on a tour of inspection across the coast because he's heard that Bessier has trounced the Spanish at Medina de Rio Seco earlier in July. So things are and although it's discouraging that his dudes can't get into Zaragoza, Girona, and Valencia, they are under siege and they will fall eventually. So things are like there is a rising happening, but nobody's really worried about it particularly. Um, and so Dupont is obviously sent down to Cadiz to sort of make the make besiege the fourth big city, and hopefully take it really easily. Uh, he has he sets off at the end of May, and he is marching through the Sierra Morena into and then descends into Andalusia, sacks Cordoba, and at this point, after because he's already sort of brushed off his forces of militia in front of Cordoba, he seems to realize how alone he is in the world. Um, Gets a little scared and retreats.
You make it sound like he has an existential crisis.
Well, it
You
almost
know, he
is.
he sits down and one day he just realizes he hasn't got any friends and he questions what he's doing with his life, which isn't quite that's probably not how Dupont would have described it when he sat down for his court martial. Spoiler alert for people.
Possibly not, no. But
Um,
he does seem to feel like he needs more men. Um, which is a fair assessment, probably, because he's realized that we don't really have any presence down here in the south. Um, and he doesn't retreat to Bailen, he retreats to Andujar, which is just to the southwest of Bailen, just a few, it's a less than a day's march from Bailen. He then just sits there for the rest of June, practically, uh, becoming more and more isolated. The Spanish militias and partisans obviously start doing their thing, and his like messengers are getting cut off and things. I haven't heard particularly the veracity of whether or not he was recalled or not because I don't know why he would have been recalled unless Joseph also lost his nerve. But it's entirely possible because messengers were going missing all the time. Um, and that's another thing. Joseph comes into Madrid in July, while he is starting to think that things aren't looking so rosy for him anymore. Dupont, that is. And Joseph is the only guy actually in Spain at this point on the French side who's writing to Napoleon, telling him, "You have no idea what you have started, bro. Listen to me. They hate me. Nobody has come to cheer me when I came into Madrid. They call me Rey Intruso, the intruder. They hate you, they hate me, and they hate all your generals messing around who I have no control over. I need 150,000 men and supreme command now." And you can tell how well that went down with Napoleon. Um, but he's the only guy who seems to think there's a problem here. that only the toadies that came with him, only the Spanish toadies who came with him from Bayonne are like his only Spanish supporters at this point. The only other French general who seems to realize something's wrong is Dupont, who's now sort of on the other, like he's sitting in Andalus, in the edge of Andalusia, on the other side of a mountain range, one road of supply in and out, and he now knows that General Castaños is quite close by. For a French general, even with Dupont's forces, this is not a massively worrying thing, realistically, because Dupont does get reinforced by, I think it's either a division or two divisions during the course of the summer, and they arrive at Bailen just as things are about to kick off. Uh, his troops are a problem, as you said before, to some extent. He has the majority of them come from the Légion de Réserve, who are supposed to be responsible for guarding arsenals and ports and things like that. Um, this is not to say that they are necessarily bad troops. It's just they're not seasoned campaigners. He does have I think it's the Marines de la Garde with him, a battalion. They're good soldiers. Uh, he also has at least three Swiss regiments with him. They're also fairly reliable. Then they're line troops as well. He's also got about 38 guns. He's also got better cavalry than any of the Spanish opposing him because the Spanish have had trouble mounting their cavalry for a long time. So although it's not the best French army, this is probably capable of avoiding what happens next.
What I find really interesting about a lot of the Spanish battlefields is just how little has changed. Um, and it it's only when you start to compare them with some of the European battlefields that you realize just how spoilt historians of the Peninsular War are in terms of the incredible state of preservation of these battles. So, folks, I would urge you to look at firstly the Wikipedia page, which does have a map of what happens at Bailen, which is taken directly from Oman. If you know the maps from Oman's A History of the Peninsular War, like you'd take one look at it and go, yeah, some copyright might have been breached there. Um, but what you can then do is just do a Google Maps search for Bailen, and you can just see the battlefield has not changed. It's beautiful. Um, and the reason I say that is because we are now going to sort of talk military stuff. Um, I spent a bit of time kind of wrestling with how I felt about what Dupont does at Bailen and whether or not it's sort of cack-handedness, which is always a very easy accusation to throw out there. You know, just sort of be very flippant to go, well, Dupont was clearly an idiot and he didn't know what he was doing. Um, Napoleon very famously says that Dupont sort of sacrifices the valor of the French army in favor of saving his baggage. There's no question Dupont is encumbered by all of the loot he's taken in Cordoba. Um, and the reason that things sort of pan out in the way that they do is at least in part because he's thinking about the fact that he needs to protect his baggage. I also get the feeling that in the days before the battle proper, he's very strung out to quite a significant extent. And I say that kind of with an eye on distances and kind of thinking about where he's come from, where he's going to. Um, am I right in thinking that Andujar is sort of one of the sort of the rear guard, if you like, of the Spanish, sorry, the French position, and the vanguard is sort of somewhere in the region of Bailen, and they basically get trounced by and outfoxed fundamentally by Castaños in the sense that Castaños engages in one direction and then, but with a much smaller proportion of his force, and then sends the bulk of his army to Bailen and sort of smacks the French hard, overwhelms them by weight of numbers, and then sort of goes, "Well, you're between two ends of my army. What do you think you're gonna do?" It, is that fair?
It yeah, it seems pretty fair from what I've seen. It's not an easy battle to get a grip on because again, we don't have good sources in English. We don't have translations, which makes it easy for us to get a good picture and detail of what's going on. From what I've seen, like a summary of the strategic situation leading up to the final day would be that Castaños, first of all, is reluctant to attack, and then he's persuaded to attack, and he decides to do so in a very logical manner. He's going to feint at Andujar, where Dupont is, and he's going to throw troops across the Guadalquivir and hit Bailen as well. And that will obviously cut the road, and he will have an encirclement happening. It does not go quite according to plan so far as I've seen. Castaños throws forward, I think it's General Cupini's brigade or division, which makes uh, a demonstration against Andujar. General Redding, Swiss mercenary, uh, that's unfair, Swiss auxiliary soldier, and the Spanish army is full of Irish, Swiss, French, you name it. The officer corps is insane. But Redding approaches the Guadalquivir, but does not cross it because he finds there are troops occupying Bailen. That is General, I think it is Verdel, in of the French reinforcements which have arrived at Bailen. In the supremest and most beautiful irony, Dupont sees the feint against Andujar, where he is, and he calls on Verdel to march to Bailen with his forces to concentrate them. This is again a very principled, logical thing. Let's concentrate the forces and we can do whatever the heck we want. Verdel does this, but in doing so, he weakens Bailen. For some unknown reason, um, Dupont does not elect to move with his entire force the next day when he is concentrated. Instead, he responds to news um, that Redding has crossed the Guadalquivir and taken Bailen, and he sends Vedel back himself to Bailen. But he finds no Spanish there. That's because Redding has pulled back again, having occupied it, and he's gone back to his original base, where he's been now reinforced by General Cupini. And Vidal does not stay in Bailen. Instead, he goes further north to a place called, I think, La Carolina, where he thinks that Redding has gone, because he thinks he's going to try and cut the road even further up by the mountains or something ridiculous like that. But he goes and takes his boys up that way. So now the French are completely strung out over the entire road from the mountains to Andujar. Dupont is alone in this position. The Spanish are poised to cut his forces in two, and indeed, I think it's between the 18th and the 19th of July, Redding reoccupies Bailen, placing himself across the road that Dupont needs to take to reunite his army, because he indeed again finds out that Vidal has is like he feels that Vidal is too far away and thinks, okay, right, I should have just gone. We should have just all gone together. And then he tries to go to Bailen, finds the Spanish are in front of him. This is where the battle starts. And so there is his rear guard does become positioned, you know, at Andujar, and his vanguard. No, I mean, where the heck is his vanguard? I don't know where top and bottom of the French army is here.
I mean, this is part of the debate, right? Is Vidal the vanguard, having sort of swanned off towards La Carolina, or is Dupont's kind of rump force now sort of fundamentally his vanguard? To give folks a sense of scale, we're talking in excess of 20 kilometers from Bailen to Andahar. That's the degree of distance that we're talking about. From memory, I believe Salamanca, the French forces are strung out over a region of 7 kilometers, give or take a little bit. Um, Granted, they're in an arc, but Marmot's got what, 8 divisions, I think it is, with him at Salamanca over an 7 kilometer front. So that's somewhere in the region of, well,
That's nicely
nominally,
concentrated. Marmont knew
yeah.
what he was doing realistically. Only one of his divisions got out of line, and that was when Wellington pounced at that, and that was
Mhm.
all that he needed. By then, you can pick your choice, really. It's if the Spanish army, this Spanish army is good. This has a lot of veterans and good infantry regiments in it, and there's a pretty solid force. It's pretty big as well. It's about 30,000 men, um, which is not a problem for the French. They have defeated Spanish armies much larger with much fewer men, but it's just asking. It's just asking to all principles of war are being sacrificed here for unclear for just for miscommunications. And Castaños now moves up behind Dupont and starts to close the door. Vidal realizes there's no enemy at La Carolina and does start to march back towards Bailen, and now there's a race against time as to who is going to cut off who, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you get that sort of sense of the net closing in. But also just remember, folks, let's say Marmont has 50,000 men at Salamanca. He doesn't really because attrition and all the rest of it, but we'll call it 50,000 men, 7 kilometers. Remember, Dupont, 20,000 men over an area that we're talking of being well in excess of 20 kilometers. This is a strung out force, and that becomes really key in terms of what happens when the penny drops for Dupont with a horrendous clang, and he realizes that now, because Reading has occupied not only Bailen but also some heights, fundamentally a sort of olive grove region over to the west, straight across the road that Dupont needs to utilize in order to link up with Vidal. He's got one choice, and that choice is I've got to go through them.
Hmm.
If I don't break through this Spanish line, I am in a net, and there is nothing I can do about it. But he doesn't seem to handle this situation particularly well. The big criticism that gets leveled to against him quite fairly is that these attacks are far too piecemeal, and there is no creation of a strategic reserve at any point. It's troops arrive and they're thrown in, troops arrive and they're thrown in. Now, the Spanish artillery does darn well. That should be acknowledged. That's definitely a contributing factor to the French defeat. But is it fair to criticize Dupont so harshly, or does he just seem at this point to get too flummoxed and not sort of pause and consider his position well enough?
It's always difficult. I think it's a really good thing for first of all civilians, first of all people who have known like we're like moderate, we're like 21st century people, to pause every time you think you should criticize an 18th or 19th century general for these reasons. First of all, we're not soldiers. Second of all, we don't know what it's like to fight in like a literally command. Like we theoretically know because we study it, but it's like we have no idea about what the stress can do. We also have perfect information to some extent. We know where Castaños is. We know where Reading is. We know where Verdel is. We know that if he would just hunker down and like draw this battle out, Verdel's going to come smashing through the back of Reading, and you're going to be fine. In fact, you might end up with with a massive Napoleon scale victory here. But he doesn't know that. He doesn't know where Verdel is. Verdel could have surrendered already, for all he knows. Um, all he sees is a bunch of heights and a lot of Spaniards on top of them, and they have quite a lot of artillery, which is doing surprisingly good execution on his troops. He needs to move. So you can't blame him really for making the decision that I need to break through. I think his criteria for making that decision based on everything the French had encountered in Spain up to this point made it a completely logical decision to take because the French have no respect for the Spanish army. They believe that, I mean, I mean, to be fair, they don't have a lot to sort of draw on to be afraid of. You have instances where literally cavalry charges send these people running for it. Entire armies are broken by a single cavalry charge in some battles in Spain in this period. So the French have this idea that if I just attack them, we'll break through. It'll be fine. And because Dupont is on the move as he's moving up the road, he has to deploy his troops off the road and then attack. He feels like the quickest way is obviously to send them in as they deploy. Um, no, I don't think it would be very difficult to put yourself in his place with his information and his understanding of the Peninsular War up to this point to act principled, and that is to spend hours deploying, suppress the Spanish guns, use your cavalry to find flanks. You know, time is of the essence. He's also worried about that ridiculous baggage train of his coming out of Andujar. So you can criticize it. I find it difficult to criticize him, particularly obviously, and also as well. If you think about it, there is a sort of a principle in warfare that if that you have to make some you have to get some kind of control. You have to understand how the battle is going, right? You must engage the enemy first and find out how they are fighting. How easy is it to make them do what I want them to do? You need to get some sort of basis. If you're running into the battle straight off the road, he has no information as to how to defeat the enemy. So the first attack is fair. I think he responds reasonably well. He just doesn't expect the Spanish to be as tough as they are. And when they're given, as Charles Esdale will tell you, as Wellington would tell you, if you give the Spanish a position to defend and you take care of their flanks, don't give them any worries about cavalry. Darn good soldiers. You don't want to mess with them head on.
I suppose what perhaps I'm reading too much into what you're saying there, but the first, I don't think anyone can blame Dupont for the first attack. That sort of testing the water, right? Um, the second and the third is I obviously it's a radio show, so folks can't see this, but sort of Josh sort of smiles wryly. Um, is that where he starts to lose a
He's
grip?
reinforcing failure at that point. Like he should see, oh wow, they repelled that attack quite neatly. Obviously, I need to do something different. But instead, he just tries to knock on the door in the same way every time. It's not easy for the Spanish, and this belies the idea that the French are subpar troops. They're very well motivated. They're well paid, relatively speaking. They're well equipped. They're soldiers of France. They're soldiers of the Emperor. Whether they're the reserves or the line battalions or the guard doesn't really matter at this point. French troops like to fight. They like to show off, and they like to beat Spaniards around the head. They have every soldier in that army has no respect for these people. They think that they're better than them. So it's they fight bravely. They fight hard. They give Reading one. It's really tense up on the ridge because, as well, Dupont has cavalry, better cavalry than he does. And there's a famous moment where the reserves have to be called in. The Spanish cowboys charge alongside their regular infantry, regular cavalry. These are the garrochistas, the guys with the long poles that do those displays in the Doma de Vaquera uh, of classical Spanish riding, and they're like armed with lances now, and they're all very sort of, they've got the matador clothes on and everything like that, and they charge into the fray with the Spanish cavalry, and they get cut to pieces. But it's part of the this is one of the most famous parts of the Battle of Bailen, apart from the one of the incidents where there's an older lady who gives General Redding a drink of water and gets shot through the vase she's handing him or something like that, which is another famous part of the battle. Uh, which also goes to say as well, by the way, you're dealing with crippling levels of heat here, right?
Well, this is part of the reason why Dupont, not the only reason, but part of the reason why he starts to, after the third attack, and I'll come back to the third attack because I want to just talk about the guard contingent there. Um, but it's part of the reason that he decides, nah, this ain't going to work because these guys haven't got a heat source at this point. They have left the riverfront at Underhar. The next set of wells, well, they're, guess what, in Bailen, which they can't access. Now, in fairness, there are a couple of rivers and all the rest of it, but it's not as though you can easily set up supply chains and just sort of pause the battle. Excuse me a moment. Castaños, would you mind awfully just waiting a minute whilst or half an hour, whilst I get my men's canteens refilled? This is, this is the midsummer,
Mm.
and South Spain in midsummer heat, very, very hot. Okay, yes, we're accustomed to sort of climate change levels of heat, but nonetheless, these
You
guys.
you go wander around London in a heat wave in a wool uniform with a pack on your back and firing a musket which will heat up in your hand to the point where you can't actually touch the barrel. Even the cannons of the Spanish artillery were having trouble by the end of the day because the bronze barrels were becoming too hot to fire. So you're risking them exploding in your hand from loose sparks the hotter they get. It's a nightmare, uh, especially as it becomes ever clearer that he's just not breaking through.
The final attempt, as I keep sort of alluding to, involves a contingent of Imperial Guard. And that's not to say that, we're talking sort of grizzled veterans of the old guard of sort of Waterloo style fame. But nonetheless, the guard are the guard as far as the shorthand works. Um, if I remember rightly, there were only about 300 of these guys. But talk us through what happens with this final attack and why it goes wrong.
Well, it's sort of too little too late, realistically, is the problem. I think that the best that Reading might have been able to do Dupont might have been able to do would have been to um, maybe with the second attack or something like that, throw his Swiss battalions and the Guard together, which comprised the sort of the toughest, most disciplined regiments, and you try and make a feint with the weak ones and break through with the tough ones using the famous ability of the French artillery to move fast, something like that. But this is the last ditch attempt to try and desperately break through the Spanish line. It's spearheaded by the Marines de la Garde, and they do make headway. They do reach the top of the crest, and the Spanish, by this point, are indeed pretty exhausted themselves. And it looks like they might just make it, but there's too much fire. There are too many Spaniards, and they are not sufficiently supported enough to really make anything of it. And the result is that they do fail to break through the Spanish line. And even if they had by this point, I don't know if the entire French force would have been able to convert it to a victory. Um, Interestingly enough, at around this time or shortly thereafter, Vidal is within striking distance of Bailen, and that is probably the best hope they had of somebody figuring out, oh, Vidal's over there. We can do this. But nobody did. And realistically, it's a too little, too late, too little support, too tired, too hot, too many casualties. And oh yeah, Castaños and the main army are also still coming up behind, and it's not workable anymore as it in terms of breaking through by the end of the day.
So does Dupont do the right thing? There's a big question. He starts to discuss terms. There's a little bit of back and forth about that. We'll talk about the terms in just a second. But is this the right move at this point in time to surrender, or should Dupont have sort of abandoned his baggage and taken his men up into some sort of mountain pass via a goat track and somehow sort of done something terribly heroic that everybody would claim that Ney would have done given half the opportunity?
Yeah. I really hope we get to talk about Ney and his reputation for the bravest to the brave thing because I'm pretty darn sure not a lot of people know why he had to do that and how he got that because he was also asked to surrender. Now, you don't get a title like the bravest to the brave from Napoleon by doing stuff Napoleon doesn't want you to do, and it's quite clear from the response that Napoleon gives Dupont that basically he did want him to practically die to the last man.
Well, in fact, off the back of this, there are changes. I think it's 1810. There are changes to the French military code fundamentally that says you do not surrender. I am not having another Bailen on my hands. You stand there and you fight and you die. And if you don't, I'll just shoot you when you come back anyway. I'll court martial you first and do it all in the right way, but you will be on trial for your life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this sort of fits in with sort of the wider impact that Napoleon has on warfare, particularly in relation to sieges, right? In terms of you are absolutely going to stand at least one assault before you even consider capitulation. So this is very much sort of the Napoleon way.
And it is quite frank. It's possibly a crime against humanity, to put it in strong terms. Um, so, did Dupont do the right thing? In terms of Napoleon, no, he did not do the right thing. In terms of military principle, possibly not still, because I think a lot of generals would have, first of all, had a go at finding out more information about what had happened to Vidal. And it's possible he might have managed to hold on long enough that messengers might have been able to get through. I don't honestly know whether or not he actually tried to do this or not while maybe he was bargaining for time and then basically just sort of said, fine, I'll just commit to this line of negotiation because I'm not seeing help arriving from anywhere.
It should be said that the Spanish don't sit idly as those
No,
negotiations go on. You know, they find a way to essentially flank the French
yeah,
from the south.
they
There's
reinforce their position. They do the right thing. They make sure that once they've been given this gift, they don't squander it.
so the terms themselves, Dupont and his staff get taken back to Rochefort, I believe, by the Royal Navy. The terms say that the rank and file will be repatriated via Cadiz. That doesn't happen. Um, Talk us through what the ideal is, I guess, first of all, in terms of these terms and that all important claim of the baggage. Is it all about I want to keep my loot?
Well, a lot of it's probably to do with keeping the loot. I mean, Juno's one was weirdly. I mean, if you think about the two surrender, I mean, actually as well, the reason why Napoleon is so incandescent with rage as well, because it's not just one surrender he has to deal with within the space of a month; it's two. Um, so, and it's just so much worse apparently for Napoleon if the Spanish do it than the British, because he has some modicum of respect for the British. But the yeah, baggage does seem to play a big part in the whole thing. Um, I have a feeling that you may know more about it than I do in terms of the actual letter of the conditions, but I do know that the although unfortunately Dupont did do sort of the humanitarian thing, because we said he kind of did the wrong thing in terms of Napoleon and in terms of military principle to some extent. He did conform to the old ideas of humanity and say, enough killing now. Let's just talk about this and see if we can come up with a deal. And unfortunately, the Spanish don't have the capacity realistically to honor their side of the deal of taking care of that many prisoners and shipping them to some place where they can be supplied. They can barely supply their own men. And about half of them die in captivity. And that's one of the big problems. That it's a big stain on the sort of like the honor of the Spanish nation at this time that they couldn't take care of these men. Um, what do you know about the baggage? Because I'm not as clear on this as you may be.
I'm still trying to get a decent handle on what happens about the baggage. I mean, I do agree with what you say. You know, the baggage features so prominently with Juno. What particularly strikes me is the Spanish do not muck around with this. Um, and to the point where, as Vidal tries to withdraw to the north, Castaños turns around and says, "Oh no,
Oh
no, no,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
no, no!
exactly, yeah.
You guys come back here and
That's brilliant. Yeah, I'd
you lay
completely
down
forgotten
your
about.
arms and you grovel and you surrender along with all of the guys we've caught in our trap. That there is no movement, not an iota, to the point where they say, "Well, look, if these guys don't do this, we're just going to shoot you all. We will massacre you."
Yeah,
It is.
I've completely forgotten about that. Yeah, not only does he like threaten basically start batch shooting Frenchmen to get Vedel to come back, he gets Dupont to order him to come back with this like tell your general to come back here now and tell him that if he doesn't.
Which shows just how brutal the threats are already getting, even at this
Mm,
really early stage in the war. You know, we are not yet sort of 3 years in, very accustomed to atrocity and counter atrocity between guerrilla and the French trying to mount what is fundamentally a counterinsurgency operation. You know,
mm,
we are not quite at that level of viciousness, or at least not at the stage yet where that level of viciousness is widely known to be commonplace. And already, you know, essentially what Castaños is threatening to do here is massacre prisoners of war. Like these guys are on the verge of capitulation. They have
yeah,
asked for they're discussing terms, and he's saying, "Look, I'll just kill a lot of you. I want all of you to lay down
yeah.
your arms. Otherwise, you're not going to be dead."
Yeah,
Um,
and Castaños is notable, as I said at the beginning, as being a kind of a affable, good-natured fellow. Um, but there's real steel here. Like, I'm going to I'm going to have the entire core of the Gironde, or I will decimate this, and I will use the excuse that I should have had the full surrender of all troops under your command to break the treaty I've just made and make it that I can just shoot the lot of you because of that. It's
I think you also get a sense of Castaños' steel when he and Dupont meet, so that Dupont can hand over his sword to Castaños, and he sort of makes this sort of grandiose comment about, you know, you must be quite remarkable because I've never lost a pitched battle until now. I've been in more than 20 battles, you know, sort of DuPont trying to puff himself up, but also massage the ego of Castaños. Castaños, he's not having any of it. All as ice, just turns around and goes, "Well, you know what's really remarkable? This is my first battle." You know, just an absolute, it's not even salt in the wound. It's killing a man when he is on the floor. Um, so Castaños has this steely streak to him. Now we sort of sit here and we joke, and we sort of laugh at the personalities involved here, but it does get quite unpleasant for the guys who don't get repatriated, doesn't it? In the sense that they are stuck on prison hulks in Cadiz Harbor, and they are fed at best sporadically. They are treated very badly. They are in severely overcrowded conditions, And it's an indicator of how bad things get that when the French lay siege to Cadiz later in the war, and there's this great storm that sees a number of ships running aground on the French side of Cadiz Harbour, the idea suddenly goes around these guys, well, hang on a minute, if we can cut the chains to the anchors, we can run a significant risk here that the ship is going to run aground on the French side of the harbour, and then we'll be able to be free. They are deliberately trying to sink their own ship
Hmm.
on the French side of the harbour, which gives you a good indication of the desperate nature of the conditions they're experiencing.
Hmm. The uh, I think a proportion of them ended up in jails and dungeons in certain places, and of course, as is the case in certain, even in the British, the ones we're not talking about, um, you don't have the space for prisoners, nor do you have the means to easily corral them and watch them. So, except for one or two places, large castles and garrisons and things like that, where you can put them, big, massive, old, moldering ships of the line and transports without they're hulks. They don't have you can't maneuver them. Is where you put them, and unfortunately, the fate of the prisoners at Cadiz and also prisoners even in Britain on hulks is very bad. It's a terrible way to handle prisoners. But the thing is, it's the early 19th century, and it is you don't have great protections for prisoners who are not officers, unless you have an immediate cessation of hostilities, in which case you can talk about what to do with them. And of course, the Napoleonic Wars grind on for a significant amount of time after this, and unfortunately, this is basically devastating to the prisoners of Bailen.
So, with an eye on the fact that this war is going to grind on, let's talk about that wider situation in Spain. Napoleon, apoplectic, um, just spitting venom and bile and having I would love to envisage a sort of temper tantrum from him in the mode of Ridley Scott, in terms of, the scale of the just what the insert expletive was that. Um, to what extent, though, is what Dupont experiences part of a wider problem that the French face, in that the French hadn't managed to take Valencia or Barcelona or Santander? They are at this point not really winning this conflict. Don't get me wrong, there is absolutely a propaganda boon to be gained from this victory that absolutely electrifies the Spanish. It catches everybody by surprise. What the hell happened there? Um, but with all of that in mind, why is it that the French sort of collapse is perhaps a slight exaggeration, because we know that what they actually do is conduct a smart retreat behind the Ebro. But why does it seem to go so far south, well, ironically, so far north in terms of where they withdraw to so quickly?
Well, Bailen is the entire crux of that sudden withdrawal. And collapse, you could use collapse if, to be honest. Bailen is, if you think about the strategic situation in terms of the fact that assaults have failed at Zaragoza, they're not getting into any of the other places you're talking about either. They're sort of locked against cities. You only have movement up in the north to some extent where they've already won a battle. Um, but the real problem is I think the real crux of why this sudden retreat occurs is down to Joseph. And that's because he's in Madrid and he hears that the Spanish have completely taken out the main fighting force in the south. And it's I don't know, a certain amount of days march up the road from Madrid. He doesn't feel like he can defend the place because he doesn't feel he has any support in the place, and it's right. Uh, and so, I think it's within 5 days or something like that after Bailen, he is out of Madrid. Um, and he has to go, and he does have to relocate behind the Ebro himself. And basically, that seems to trigger most French forces to follow him because I guess they don't understand exactly what's happening either. And it's just if we're not going to hold Madrid, then the sensible thing to do is to get behind the Ebro and think up a new plan. Um, and it's just a startling reversal of events realistically, because some of these cities were going to fall eventually. But news of Bailen completely changes the strategic situation. And Napoleon says something like, they're like whenever they're acting like a bunch of police inspectors, not generals down there. I don't know what's wrong with them. He's just completely confused as to why they've shown such weakness in the face of the Spanish when things were going relatively well. Uh, and to some extent, I guess you can't really blame him for thinking that way. But at the same time, sort of the principled thing would be indeed to perhaps fall back and take a greater stock of what's happening, in case perhaps the Spanish have managed to pull off a sort of a reputable fighting force, which is now going to come barreling down the road, and maybe Castaños and Blaque will maybe be able to trap whatever forces the French still have in the north. I don't know if Bessier, I think Bessier is still in Spain at this time. Maybe they're going to trap Bessier. Who knows what's going to happen? They do know by this point as well that the British are messing around in Portugal. Quite a lot of them, in fact. Unusual amounts of British soldiers are in Portugal. So everything you just have a chain reaction of failures. You have failures to get into the cities. You have complete disaster at Bailen. You have also complete disaster in Portugal. Two French armies, or two French corps, we'll call them, have surrendered, which equates to one single army in some cases. Um, it's 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 a remarkable thing that the Spanish have just managed to pull off, and in a way, they kind of become victims of their own propaganda.
They do indeed. I mean, at this stage, it is very clear that France is not about to achieve a victory in this conflict that means the war is going to be over by the autumn. Now, whether or not the war will be over in time for Christmas is a teaser that we will leave for a second episode. But I do want to just spend a moment reflecting on Dupont. Um, what surprised me when I was doing work for the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity was that in Southampton Old Cemetery is the grave of a guy whose middle name is Napoleon and his surname is Dupont. It is Dupont's son,
Eh,
who clearly, for reasons that I've never been able to find out, ends up moving to the UK. He marries an English girl, and I believe he ends up being a school teacher. Um, I think he's also got kind of associations with the local Roman Catholic sort of Sunday school and things. Um, so it's a funny thing to stumble across when you're just sort of wandering the cemetery, sort of obviously on a lookout for Napoleonic names, and then the name Napoleon jumps out from a grave at you. It's an unusual thing. I think his first name is Hubert. Um, I will need to check that. I'm very gradually sort of trying to get his grave looking a little bit better, even though he's not a direct
hmm.
combatant, obviously. Um, so what happens to Dupont? Court-martial, prison. Is that it for his career?
I mean, as far as I know, it is. Yeah, I don't think he ever resurfaces again or is given a second chance. He has so badly let Napoleon down that even the core of the observation of the Gironde or something like that, as it was called, even with its reservists, small and Swiss soldiers, and there was a regiment of the Guard in there. The fact that they had to desperately start melting their eagles or whatever it was just such a it kind of gives you a slight insight into Napoleon's ego at this point that he so loses it about this to the extent that he feels only he personally can rectify the situation to the extent that it was in 1807. It shows you a little bit of what was going on in his head. It's a fascinating reaction, and it's all because Dupont surrendered at Bailen.
Spot the egomaniac in the story, right? Yeah, from memory, Dupont. I think there are rumors actually that Dupont's murdered, and he's not. He's let out of prison with the Bourbon Restoration. Um, but yeah, it's the end of the road for him in terms of
Yeah,
his
yeah,
immediate career, which of course leads us to speculate what might have been. But if the guy had, if this guy had a Bailen in him, um, what damage might he have done if he'd been elevated to a marshal? There is a question.
he would certainly have been made like the Duc de Bailen if he'd managed to pull off a victory there. That would have, I mean, Castagnos is made Duque de Bailen. Um, there's a dukedom in this battle somewhere. But it's not for poor old Dupont who made the wrong calls. It seems it has to be said realistically, tactically, strategically during the battle. Made perhaps the humane call at the end of the battle, and then paid the price doubly.
Josh, it's always a joy to talk to you about these events. I thought this might be a 40-minute episode. It's actually gone on for double that. Thank you ever so much for being so generous with your time. Folks, Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira and Every Hazard and Fatigue. You need to go and buy them from hellion.co.uk. We will make sure there is a link in the show descriptor. Please do show your support for the countless hours that Josh has given to your earbud entertainment devices, which is a thing, I'm sure. Go and buy the books if you haven't already. Hopefully, you're listening to this on Christmas Day or Boxing Day, and you are now full of money that is burning a hole in your pocket, and therefore you need to go and spend it on Josh's books to continue your education in the Napoleonic era. Josh, you will be back in order to talk us through the Corunna campaign, Napoleon's invasion, like his personal invasion of the remainder of Spain, and much more besides. We will very much look forward to that. But folks, that is it for this one. This has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car. And then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds. And if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.